I grew up in Bradford, Pennsylvania. Have any of you ever heard of Zippo lighters? They're from here. A thick forest surrounds the town, along with most of the neighborhoods. My family lives sort of on the outskirts of Bradford. Of course, much like the town itself, our house was also surrounded by forest. If you took in the scene from our back porch, you would see nothing but sprawling trees for miles. I tell you this so you can gain a sense of isolation. Out at my house, you could scream at the top of your lungs, and no one would come to help you. This happened back in the summer of 1996. I was 11 years old at the time. I had a childhood friend named Marty, who was the same age. Our fathers worked together and knew each other well. He would come over almost every Friday to hang out. Marty and I found ourselves hiking through the trees as we often did. However, we were feeling a bit daring and went further into the forest than we usually did. There was this barrier of trees that we would never go past, simply because I didn't know the area beyond that point. We continued past the barrier into uncharted territory. We eventually came upon a clearing. In the middle of this clearing was an old, disheveled-looking tent. Being the curious young men we were, we of course had to see inside. As we approached, I could feel the temperature around me drop. I'm no stranger to the cold, but this was in the middle of summer. Even at my age, I could sense that there was something truly sinister inside this tent. A part of me was screaming to hightail it out of there, but my own curiosity pushed me forward. We both stopped just outside the tent, and suddenly, we were both too frightened to move any further. We were both frozen in place, staring at the open flap of the tent as it swayed from side to side. The sky seemed to grow even darker since we discovered this tent, and though we were standing directly in front of it, we could not see inside. What happened next is the reason that I still struggle with alcoholism. A dark hand slowly emerged from the tent's opening. It reached out to us, with long black nails protruding out from its fingertips. I'm not ashamed to admit that I pissed myself out of fear. The hand slowly turned and made a beckoning gesture with its index finger, and that's when Marty and I heard a deep, bellowing laughter from inside the tent. I don't remember much about what happened after that. I just remember me and Marty running for our lives, tearing through the woods and back to my house. I do have a vague memory of me briefly looking behind me as I ran to see a tall, dark, and human figure standing just outside the tent. Upon returning, Marty immediately called his mom to come pick him up. My mother asked us what was wrong, and we both explained to her that we saw some kind of creature in the forest. My mother ultimately dismissed our claims, but led us in a prayer while we waited for Marty's mom to arrive. Marty never came back after that, and we sort of drifted apart. Sadly, Marty began hanging out with the wrong crowd and began doing hardcore drugs when he was around 14. He ended up hanging himself in his bedroom when he was 17. As for myself, I suffered from severe night terrors that tormented me for years after that day in the woods. I'm not going to get into what I experienced in my nightmares, but I will say that I became an alcoholic as a result. After moving far away and attending numerous AA meetings, I'm glad to say that I've turned my life around, and I even have a family of my own. I still visit Bradford every now and again to check in on my aging parents. Whenever I'm there, I always set flowers on Marty's grave. I'm still convinced that what we saw that day in the woods contributed to his death. Now that I have some perspective, I think what Marty and I encountered was a demonic presence. It followed us home and proceeded to turn both of our lives upside down. There were rumors of people worshiping Satan out there in those woods around the mid to late 90s. Perhaps they awakened something, and Marty and I just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. I've grown up in rural areas for my entire life. Whether it was cow farms up in Tennessee or living in the middle of nowhere, Florida, I've done it all. We were accustomed to not having access to the internet, or TV, and even cell phones. I like to think of us as the last true generation before the internet age. It's not to say that dial-up wasn't around, we just didn't have access to it. But honestly, it wasn't really all that bad outside of the long, boring summer days, where we would be practically cooked alive out in the fields. We lived in an old Civil War cabin in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee, and it definitely produced some pretty interesting experiences. This story is just one of many, and it starts off like any other really. It was a typical Friday night. My brothers and I were home alone, and seeing how there wasn't much to entertain us, we began playing manhunt in and around the house. Most of the time we opted to stay indoors as it was pitch black outside. For a bit more context, our cabin was situated on top of a rather steep hill that had a long winding driveway running down it. Our cabin had a basement level. The main level was where most of the house was, and the upstairs only had my room. We also had a back deck that was elevated about 10 to 12 feet in the air. Anyways, as I said, it was pitch black outside, and going out further than our front porch at night wasn't really something anyone enjoyed doing out there. The game was fun, but after a while it got pretty monotonous with what little room that we had to play with. At this point, I had the bright idea to wander outside and hide on the roof to make the game more interesting. This would soon be one of the biggest regrets in my life. At first, everything seemed fine. It was rather cold out that night as it was nearing fall, and the weather was just starting to change. There was a slight breeze in the air. After a few minutes of just sitting up there on the roof, I felt that something was off. I had been practically mesmerized by the sound of crickets and cicadas when I realized that all the noises of the night suddenly stopped. This seemed very odd to me. Being as naive as I was at the time, I didn't realize that this only meant something bad was going to happen. I sat there as still as possible, just listening. I didn't seem to hear anything aside from the slight breeze through the leaves. Then as quickly as the silence came, an eruption of noise came from the other end of the roof. For a bit more detail, we had a metal roof at the time, making it very easy to hear when things would hit it. It sounded like something had landed on the opposite side of the roof. I looked over, but I couldn't see anything. This, of course, left me rather unnerved. My first thought was to get down from the roof. Before going into a full-blown panic, I remember it could possibly be my brothers messing with me, since surely they would have given up looking for me by now. I opened up the window to my bedroom and called for my brothers. They both ran up the stairs shouting and complaining that the roof was off limits. When my oldest brother got to me, I asked him if they had been messing with me while I was up on the roof. He of course denied this and wanted to come up and investigate. So he and I slowly made our way to the middle of the roof. Everything went quiet around us once again. At this point, I was already on edge. We heard what sounded like pounding at the far end of the roof, in the opposite direction of where we were standing. After what I think was 3 sets of 6 pounding noises, it suddenly charged us. At least I think it did. It sounded like a pair of hooves stomping on the metal roof, but the only issue was we couldn't see a thing. Aside from us, the entire roof was clear, but somehow we could hear these stomping footsteps. It quickly began running circles around us. I held my arms out to try and see if I could feel anything, but I couldn't. And the strangest part of all was that we could feel the vibrations of the footsteps around us, but we could not feel anything in the air. The entity circled us for what seemed like many minutes, but was probably no more than 60 seconds. It suddenly stopped circling us, and we could hear the steps trail off the roof and disappear. We quickly ran back inside and locked all the windows and doors. We spent the rest of that night huddled together, freaked out as hell. I want to give some perspective to the setting. This occurred on the morning after Thanksgiving in 2016. I was 15 at the time, and I was staying at my dad's house for the holiday. I was sleeping on the top bunk of my bed. This particular bunk bed had stairs instead of a ladder. This is where my story begins. I began to stir in my bed, and eventually I woke up. I was confused, and I checked my phone for the time, as I usually did when I would wake up unexpectedly in the night. I saw that the time was 3:30 a.m. I chuckled to myself, seeing that it was the witching hour. But then my attention was brought to something else. I heard a sound. The best way I can describe it is meat being eaten off of a bone. My dad's house was going through some remodeling at the time, and most noises would tend to echo throughout the house. The sound was coming from within my room, more specifically in the corner of my room between the bookcase and TV. It sounded too close to be outside my window or out in the hall. I didn't have my TV on, nor was I listening to anything through my headphones. This sound was coming from the inky blackness in my room. The only thing I could hear was smacking lips and grotesque chewing. At this point, I was hiding under my blankets and rubbing my eyes to make sure I was fully awake. I have never experienced sleep paralysis in my life, and I've been able to distinguish vivid dreams from reality. I was clearly conscious. I was trying to make sense out of this situation the best I could, but I was having a hard time rationalizing this. The sound persisted, getting a bit louder. I grabbed a pair of needle-nose pliers that I used to make crafts earlier that day and was too lazy to put back. I had no idea what to do at this point. If I decided to use the bunk bed stairs to exit my room, I would have ended up right where the sound was coming from. And had I just jumped off the opposite side of the bed, which was closer to the door, I could have really hurt myself in the dark. I also wasn't planning on using the flashlight on my phone and run the risk of being attacked by the thing in my room. The thought came into my head that I should contact someone. I slipped my hand out from under the covers to grab my phone. Apparently, I had been listening to this horrifying noise for about 20 minutes. I was trying to figure out what the noise could possibly be, and the only thing that I could think of was my family being cannibalized, and I was next. I know that's a little extreme, but that's all my brain could come up with. I really couldn't tell you why I thought that was the case in this scenario, but the thought was on repeat inside my head. Hell, I wasn't even sure if what was making the sound was human or not. We did have an alarm system. Nothing had been tripped, so I was beyond confused. Now I was going to have to make a choice on who I should contact about this terrifying situation. At first, I was thinking about texting the people I cared about, like my mom, my partner at the time, my close friends, as I didn't know what was to come next. I was then heavily considering contacting the authorities, but I'm not a huge fan of the police, and I was concerned that if they arrived unexpectedly, my dad would be pissed if there turned out to be nobody in my room. I then realized that contacting my dad would be my best bet. That's if he was still alive. He kept at least 2 guns at his bedside at all times. I came to the conclusion that I should try to get his attention. I attempted to text him at first, as that was the stealthiest option. I typed out a paragraph explaining how I woke up, and thought that someone was in my room. I insisted that he get his gun. I listened closely to see if I could hear my dad's phone go off, or even if I could hear his usually loud snoring. I couldn't hear either. I assumed that his phone was on vibrate, so that meant that I had to call him and hoped that he answered. His phone rang a few times before he picked up. Hello? Check your phone, I whispered as quietly as I possibly could. What? Check your texts, I whispered a little louder before hanging up. The pressure in the room somehow managed to get even heavier as I hung up the phone. The sound grew louder and shifted closer to my bed. Recounting this next part still makes my skin crawl. I heard whatever this thing was brush past the vase on top of my bookshelf. The sound was shortly followed by the first step of my bunk staircase creaking. My heart sunk and the blood in my veins ran cold. Suddenly, my bedroom light was switched on. I threw my blanket off to see my dad in the doorway, pistol in hand. The sound had instantly stopped, and there was nothing on the stairs. My dad looked around, trying to figure out what was going on. I bursted out into tears and shook violently. I thought I was going to be murdered in my own bedroom. My dad told me to come with him. I slowly got up and made my way onto the stairs. I peeked over into the small space between the stairs and the wall, which would have been the only place for a person to hide in my room. Luckily for me, there was no one there. I went into the living room with my dad. We had 2 couches. My Nana slept on one, and I was going to sleep on the other. My dad asked me what happened, and I explained everything to him as best I could. I was trying not to have a panic attack. He was very confused considering how early it was, and I was rambling on about how I thought there was a cannibal in my room. He made sure the alarm was on and said that he would take me to my mom's in the morning, as he didn't know what to make of the situation. I don't think that this was a hallucination or some kind of trick of the mind, because I've never experienced anything like that for half an hour straight. The only way that I can explain what happened was that I had a paranormal encounter. I believe in spirits, demons, and other things of that nature. Whatever that thing was gave off a very negative energy. That wasn't the first or last experience I had in that house, but I've never had anything that intense happen to me since.